Now we move on to the Middle East and something called the Pan-Arab Transnational Media System. Now, on Monday, I asked everyone in our meeting, how many of you have heard of transnational media? And none of you raised your hand. Although whenever we come to the end, we'll think about if you really have or not. And I think many of you have, you just didn't realize that's what it's called sometimes. But what is this transnational media system in the Middle East, the Pan-Arab system? And it has influences from many places: Egypt, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. But in general, we're focusing on Saudi Arabia and Lebanon in this context and in this chapter. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. But what is transnational media? Let's start there. Transnational media system is the idea that people are using media from other countries to transmit messages into their own country. That's the transnational part. You are crossing borders of states, of countries, in order to use media messages that do not originate within your own country. That's pretty novel. That's pretty interesting. That's something we need to think about as far as, should we shift our focus moving forward to such systems? But before we get there, let's jump into this Saudi-Lebanese connection and see exactly what it is and what's going on. So why are Saudi Arabia and Lebanon the two countries that have the strongest influence in this system? And why is it the focus of this conversation, this chapter? Well, we have three major reasons. One is money. Saudi Arabia is arguably the richest country in the region. So it has the resources. Its people have the resources to be a big part in this system. Lebanon, professionalization and liberalization. Lebanon, out of the Arab states in the Middle East, is arguably the freest. We'll talk about that in Freedom House in a moment. But the freest country with the most liberal media in the region. So you are able to, with Saudi Arabian money, buy influence in Lebanese media, which are freer than media in any other country. So that's why those two states are the biggest agents in this system. Now, that being said, are there other competitors in it? For sure. In Qatar, you have Al Jazeera. It's a huge one. And in fact, there's still an embargo and a blockade. Several Middle Eastern countries are embargoing Qatar. And one of the requests for them in order to end the embargo is to shut down Al Jazeera. This has been going on for well over a year. Right? Another big competitor would be Egypt. Egyptian media are huge, have been for quite some time. And Egypt exports their media all over the Middle East. But still, you could argue Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, direct competition with those, are still more important in this system. And then one other element about this that is also competition with this Saudi-Lebanese connection, and that's the Saudi Crown Prince and his Vision 2030. Now, Vision 2030 is an idea for revamping the economy, diversifying the economy, trying to get it away from oil, but also trying to liberalize things a little bit, at least its image as a country, to attract specifically Western tourists, once again to help diversify the economy. So a lot's changing in Vision 2030 as well. Like many of you will have heard, almost 2 years ago this summer, women gained the right to drive in Saudi Arabia. You know, that was a big deal. Women could go to sporting events that men were at. It's a big deal. Things are changing. So the Saudi Crown Prince is a competitor of this system in and of itself. But we'll continue to talk about that as we move forward. So now we have a bit of a basis for the kind of system we're looking at in the Middle East. Let's bring our variables into it. And specifically, we want to talk about political parallelism and media structure. All right, so I'll go ahead and tell you newspaper circulation is exceedingly low. It has almost always been. There are urban-rural divides in the Middle East. But aside from that, it's a TV-dominant and a satellite TV especially dominant system. Also, radio is extremely important. So that's media structure. What about political parallelism? So, sorry, one of the points on the slide says, how do Saudi Arabian political forces, different princes, businessmen, and clerics, use the Lebanese media market as far as political parallelism goes? Well, the first point we need to make is that political parallelism inside of the state of Saudi Arabia is extremely high because the government owns and operates all media. So once again, this is similar to political parallelism, China, South Africa, Russia. It's a one-party state, but it's really not a one-party state. It's a monarchy. So the government owns everything. So the government message, Crown Prince's message, Vision 2030's message, that's the dominant message in Saudi Arabian media domestically. However, the Saudi-Lebanese connection and the trans-Arab media system indicates that the domestic media are not necessarily the most important part. And what happens is these princes, businessmen, and clerics take the money that they have, invest in Lebanese media markets to produce a specific message that would be illegal in Saudi Arabia. They get it produced in Lebanon and then export it back to Saudi Arabia. So what you end up having, because of this dynamic between domestic media and transnational media, you end up with a pluralistic view of media coverage, to where you can get different political views. Meaning, okay, so political parallelism is going to be high, but for a very, very different reason and created in a different way than any of the models could have ever anticipated. So once again, political parallelism is high. Domestically, government owns and operates all the message. But transnationally, you get a pluralistic view exported back into Saudi Arabia. This is fascinating, something we haven't seen before, but once again, we're going to continue thinking about throughout the semester. So now let's take all of our variables and try to fit Saudi Arabia into one of our models and see how it measures up using this transnational system. So role of the state, generally speaking, high, but it's mixed and it's dynamic. It's not just the role of the state in media, it's other political forces are using their influence internationally to send media back into the country and thereby affect consumption in the country. So granted, people can consume different media, right? And this is tied with political parallelism. Because people are consuming these different political views, parties definitely have high influence, high political parallelism, but it completely goes over newspaper circulation. You would never be able to print a newspaper with anti-government messages in Lebanon and have them brought into Saudi Arabia. It wouldn't make it. Now, does some of it happen sometimes? Probably so, but on a very, very small scale. So media structure newspaper circulation is low and probably pretty irrelevant. Political parallelism, high. Role of the state, high. Journalistic professionalism. By democratic standards inside of Saudi Arabia, it would be low. However, whenever you mesh it together with the international system, the transnational Saudi-Lebanese connection, that professionalism is actually pretty good, comparatively speaking. So once again, you have these values where it looks like Saudi Arabia would be put in the polarized pluralist model. However, you have to put an asterisk next to every single one of them, because these values aren't filled out just by looking at Saudi Arabia. These values have to be filled out by looking at the transnational media system, which once again, our models have no way of incorporating into them. So now we know the model doesn't work for a transnational media system. What does our author suggest? What are things like in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon right now? Well, the author suggests, very frankly, we should move away from comparative analysis, focusing on the country. And what we should do is switch our focus to transnational media systems. Because really, that's more of what we're starting to get in the world today. Remember, on Monday I asked you if you ever heard of a transnational media system. Well, let me ask you, how many of you consume news from the BBC? Every time you hear me do a podcast, almost at least one story comes from the BBC. And our BBC app that we get on our phone, or the BBC webpage that we go to online, is bbc.com.us. It's not bbc.uk. Remember, different countries have different country codes for their internet address. The BBC's actual webpage is bbc.uk, but they have a BBC for the US. That means that the British Broadcasting Corporation is producing media directly for a US audience. That is a transnational system. Globo TV in Brazil, we talked about that. They export media all over the world. Their telenovelas that are in Portuguese, they also do them in Spanish and export them all over Latin America. Transnational media system. So perhaps we should start looking at this. Something we're going to talk about at the end of this book and the next one is that it seems like more and more media corporations are being consumed by a small number at the top. And that number at the top is decreasing. And they are going more transnational. Now, are we there yet to where the whole world is transnational? No, probably not. But we are probably at a place where we should start this conversation to see if we should switch focus. Now, what's been happening in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon now? How is the Saudi-Lebanese connection still going? So Saudi Arabia, their Freedom House score is 7 out of 100. If you can believe it, they are less free than China. Right? And this has been the same for the past few years. Their Reporters Without Borders score is 173 out of 180. Right? And it's actually gotten a little bit better over the past 2 years. Part of this is probably attributed to the Crown Prince's Vision 2030 plan, because he is trying to westernize the image of Saudi Arabia some. This has influenced media coverage a little bit. Remember, they're still ranked in the 170s, and there's only 180 countries there. All right. What about Lebanon? Lebanon is right now Freedom House 43 out of 100, which is partially free, but they've actually gained 2 spots in the past couple of years. So they're doing a little bit better. Although economically, they're having a lot of hardships right now. So things could be changing in Lebanon moving forward. It's something we have to keep our eye on. Freedom Press in Lebanon. Remember I said it's comparatively good to other Middle Eastern countries? Well, they're ranked 101. They've lost a spot in the past couple of years. 101 out of 180 countries puts them just below the halfway point as far as media freedoms in the world. So not great, but still, comparatively speaking, much better than most of the region. In these cases, this transnational media system, and specifically satellite TV and the internet, because a lot of satellite TV is broadcasted via the internet, is so interesting and something we need to talk about in the forums. Is this the way of the future? Streaming can be from all over the world. Isn't streaming, if it comes from another country, transnational media system? Netflix exports all over the world. Is that transnational media? At me in the forums. This is a conversation I look forward to having. If you're seeing this, hello. I hope you are doing well. And this also means you're watching the lecture videos. Well done. It's what you're supposed to do. But since you're doing it, if you're seeing this, email me for a bonus point on an assignment or attendance. And have a great day.